Y'all, there's been a death on the Nile. Hey everyone, today we're talking about, Death on the Nile. I couldn't really come up with a better intro. For those who are unfamiliar, Death on the Nile is an adapted Agatha Christie novel. It is a sequel as well to Murder on the Orient Express. Both have to do with the detective, I cannot say it in French, Hercule Poirot.
That is not correct.
Poirot. Definitely his name is Poirot. But basically, Poirot is a detective. He is called into cases where people believe a murder will take place because he is one of the world's best detectives, if not the best in the world. But here's a little description for those unfamiliar with Death on the Nile. Poirot finds himself in the middle of another case when a wealthy bride hires him to keep watch over herself and her new husband during their honeymoon, with their wedding party, which is full of old jealousies, jaded ex-lovers, and those hungry for the bride's fortune. This film is one I had looked forward to for a while. There are a lot of big names that get thrown in these mystery films. There's several people in this film who you will recognize, but I don't feel like it has the same celebrity appeal that the Murder on the Orient Express did. We'll start with the bad, because I do have some good qualities of this film, but overall I think it's a very mixed bag and it's going to appeal to you differently depending on what you like to watch. For this film, I think it's poorly paced. A good first half of the film is pre a murder actually happening, which was pointed out to me by a fellow critic, nocturnal critic. We bumped into each other after the screening and we're talking about how the end of Orient Express ends with Poirot being called because there was a death on the Nile, and that's like a reference to the book, to the sequel. But when this film begins, there is no murder that has taken place, and Poirot is kind of wandering aimlessly, and he eventually ends up in Cairo. I feel like the first half of the film is really an expository dump, so that at the end of the movie, when the mystery is revealed, you feel the impact of why people are doing the things they do. And I just felt like a lot of that could have been cut down and condensed to be a more swift film. I feel like there's a lot of lingering that the camera does in this film, again, for better and for worse. It is very much a film that likes to have spectacular to it, which I feel like just does not serve the mystery, because any and all of these people, as we've learned from any mystery film, could be lying, could have ulterior motives, could be telling the truth but look like they're lying. You don't really get a solid introduction to all of the characters, even though we're spending so much time doing that. It just feels like it's kind of purposeless at the beginning of this movie. There are just a lot of random scenes or parties or events that the characters are involved in that just sort of linger throughout the film with no real connection. And the titular Death on the Nile does not even happen until I would say the midpoint of the film, and everything from there is really the mystery, figuring everything out. And while there are interesting scenes leading up to that, I just felt like a lot of it was sort of fluff. There's a lot of CGI that's used and green screen to try to represent Egypt and London at that period of time and, take you back to what the pyramids would look like. But this movie is about a mystery, and so I'm not really feeling like I'm supposed to be impressed by the pyramids, and the CGI was either really just like excessive and overly animated in some of the shots of the Nile itself pulling onto the riverboat that most of the movie takes place on. It just all feels like a little excessive, and then the use of the green screen was just honestly terrible. It's either oversaturated and it doesn't like mesh with the rest of the film, or it's just so like unrealistic that I'm not really sure why it's included. There were some really pretty color palettes and just design used. Obviously it takes place in a wedding, it's in summer, so there's lighter, more pastel colors, and I just felt like some of these green screens were used in a way that just did not add to the movie. They just felt like, let's just sink a bunch of money into this to distract from some of the other problems this film has. This movie has a lot of unfortunate things happen for it. Obviously, Armie Hammer, one of the stars of this film, was involved in a lot of scandals and is very much on the outs of Hollywood. The film tries its best to still serve the story while not drawing a lot of attention to Armie Hammer's character. It's just very... You see, like, I don't really know how to explain it. It's just unfortunate. What's also unfortunate is because of those scandals and shooting efforts and of course the pandemic, this movie's gotten delayed, I think far later than it probably would have been intended to initially. And adding on to that, in that time span between Orient Express and this film, Knives Out released, which a lot of people really loved, including critics and awards. I still think it's one of the best murder mysteries I've ever seen. It is a wonderful film in every aspect of the word, and this movie, unfortunately, just doesn't do it as well as Knives Out did. It probably never was going to, and I definitely went in with expectations that it wasn't going to be nearly as good as Knives Out. but I think that's just, again, it's an unfortunate occurrence that this wildly popular other murder mystery franchise that is very similar, relies on a star-studded cast and the singular, well-known detective character, and it's unfortunate for this film. I just can't use unfortunate enough. Like, that's just the principal word I would use to describe this movie. I think a lot of things happened outside of the screen, yet what's inside of it doesn't necessarily justify everything else going on. In a lot of ways, this film was messy. That's with the poor pacing, of course, but I do think there are some really great attention to detail in the second half of the film. Obviously, anything involving a mystery, there were certain clues or evidence pieces that will be used in this movie that I think by the end of the film, they did a really good job wrapping up where each of those pieces were, or how they related to the eventual killer or killers. I will not reveal anything about that. And yet, like it was pointed out to me, it forgot those details from its very first film. Like, it's not like you can't go back and rewatch the first film, and figure out where you ended it and make sure everything matches up. They felt like almost enough time had passed, it had gotten by, but anyone that's going to rewatch Murder of the Orient Express beforehand, which you definitely do not have to, there's almost no correlation between the films other than Poirot being the main detective character in both. There's just a lot of elements like that it's like, on one hand, it's really smart in the way that it uses its evidence pieces at the end of the film. Like any mystery or heist, there is some element of an exposition dump at the end, and while those elements have been planted earlier in the story, it doesn't feel earned in this movie, I guess, and that could just be a personal thing. I will say, I saw this movie with my younger brother, and we were talking about it afterwards, and I really prefer Murder of the Orient Express to this one. Obviously, I prefer Knives Out to both of them, but we're not talking about that right now. But he said that this one was much more interesting than Murder on the Orient Express. So if you weren't the biggest fan of Orient Express, you may find yourself liking and enjoying this one more. I just felt like there were so many unnecessary elements to this one that Orient Express, at least in my memory, did not have. I also wanted to add that I think while the reveal of the killer or killers is not obvious, I do feel it's guessable. And that's not something that's bad. That probably means that the elements are used wisely in the film so that if you're paying enough attention, you can pick apart who could have done it. But I felt like after the first movie ending with who the killer or killers were, and that one, this one you can kind of decipher that they're not going to do the same thing again, and then potentially figure out where it's going. Again, I don't think that's necessarily anything against the film. I just had to state that. There's some great red herrings in here. There's a lot of switches of the plot and like additions in there. Again, some of them earned, some of them not. And so it's just a very mixed bag. Also, the ending of this film, again, with the poor pacing of it, makes the ending feel sudden in a way where I think it should feel more conclusive than this. Everything does get tied up, but I don't know that it's necessarily in the way that anyone watching the movie would enjoy. It doesn't feel like this film has much of a future, or this franchise does. And I think to some extent the film already knows that in the way that it ends. However, I do think that Kenneth Branagh, if he wanted to make another one, he is the director of this film, and I believe the first one, if he wanted to do another one, he could, because I do think he has the most intrigue to his character, both in backstory, in any of the humor is really related to his character. I did not find this movie very funny, honestly. There were parts that I think were very obviously played to be humorous, and yet no one laughed in the theater, and that just made for like a little bit of an uncomfortable situation in a murder mystery. Like, there's not a lot of levity to this that there is in something like Knives Out. Ultimately, my feelings on this movie can be summed up in the sense that it was an unfortunate timing of a lot of unfortunate events related to this movie. I think it's a mixed bag. I think if you enjoy murder mystery or just a mystery film in general, or are a fan of any one of the like major stars of this film, I think you will enjoy it. However, I just don't think it is nearly as strong as a film as the first one or others within the genre. It's a good way to pass 2 hours of time if you are interested, and you probably might come out enjoying the movie. Again, it's not bad. I just personally can't recommend it to you. I also just had to add this. I think the mixed bag elements of this movie, or if you would have caught it without seeing the entire lead up of the first act, you may have enjoyed it more as like a TV movie on in the background while you do something else, or you're just sort of tuning in. I could have seen myself enjoying this film much more watching it on my couch doing laundry and periodically catching up, because I do think the elements are there. I just think altogether the film is worse than the sum of its parts, or I don't know how to use that equation, but the parts are better than the whole, I guess. Those are my thoughts on Death on the Nile. Please let me know in the comments down below if you plan to see this movie. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have an absolutely amazing day or night whenever you're getting to watch this, and I will see you in my very next video. Bye, y'all.